I was hired by the US Navy to investigate a strange wreck in the North Sea. In 2023, I was a PhD student in biology and attended an ESA conference, mostly presenting some astrobiology-related research results, nothing fancy or controversial. During a networking event, a US Navy officer who was attending the conference struck up a conversation with me. He seemed particularly interested in my research background and, after some small talk, casually suggested I apply for a military-sponsored research project. He said they needed biologists for a study in the North Sea. I had no GF, no pets, no immediate career plans, and the pay was good. So, I applied. The selection process was a bit hysterical. Security clearances, background checks, even questions about an old high school friend I hadn't talked to in years. I learned that he is gay and living in China now. By that point, I knew this was not a regular project, but still, I had nothing to hide, so I went along with it. After a few months, I was flown to Germany, where I met the rest of the team. They were mostly young, promising, but not yet established in their respectable fields. People who could disappear for months without raising too many questions. From there, we were taken by boat to an oil rig somewhere in the North Sea. Our funds were confiscated on the way there, but we were warned about that in advance, so no biggie. The research base was either purpose-built for the project or was an oil rig refitted for it, but from the outside, it looked like a regular drilling station, probably to avoid scrutiny. Around 30 people there were engineers, biologists, linguists, and military personnel overseeing the whole thing. We could send and receive emails to family, but they were reviewed by Navy personnel, no attachments allowed. Otherwise, no internet access, no calls home, etc. They told us that a private oil company had discovered a strange structure on the seabed. At first, they thought it was a World War II submarine wreck, but sonar imaging ruled that out. What they found instead was an elongated, spike-like object about 50 meters long, broken in half, embedded in a crater as if it had impacted at high speed. When I arrived, the engineers were debating how to bring it to the surface. Inflatable flotation devices were considered, but the risk of breaking the object was too high. Instead, they deployed remote control robots that could take pictures and retrieve samples. The depth made human diving impractical, especially since most of us were not trained for it. The exterior of the object was encrusted with barnacles, seaweed, sediment, and so on. Cleaning it took 2 more weeks. The outer layer was a carbon composite that was brittle, shattering like glass when dropped, but at the same time, it was almost impossible to bend or melt. We did not receive exact results on dating while I was still there, but based on how overgrown it was, it must have spent centuries on the seafloor at least. For the first month, only the engineers had anything to do. Then, 5 weeks in, they found a sealed, pressurized compartment. The engineers built an external pressurized seal to access the chamber. Inside, we found what was unmistakably a control room. No oxygen, dust-covered consoles, broken panels, and 3 bodies. The first 2 were small, about a meter tall, humanoid but weird. Their heads looked oversized for their bodies, but probably would be normal-sized on a regular human. Hairless, no ears or noses, though there were signs these had been removed surgically. They were also castrated. Their eyes were covered by black lenses, implanted directly into the sockets, a bit like built-in sunglasses. At first, we thought they were naked, but eventually, we figured out they were wearing skin-tight suits that had until now decayed to dust. X-rays and ultrasound scans showed their bodies were riddled with metallic implants, like tiny shards of metal. We thought they were shrapnel from the crash, but they were distributed too deliberately to be accidental. The bodies were still connected to their seats by cables plugged directly into the backs of their skulls. The 3rd body was different. It was tall, over 2 meters, with more human proportions, with long white hair. It was probably just bleached from the passage of time though, and it was female. No surgical mutilations. She had implants too, but fewer, and in different areas. She also had an artificial kidney. Her suit, unlike the others, was mostly intact. Underneath it, we found plenty of tattoos. They resembled handwriting, but did not match any inscriptions we found, so it probably meant something else. The cause of death was obvious. All of them were killed by the impact, with the female's head nearly detaching from her neck. The linguists attempted to analyze the symbols on the control panels, but they were too faded to read. One metal plate above the consoles had a short inscription etched into it, so it didn't fade. The script consisted of vertical lines with dots, and triangles written on them at different heights, a bit like musical notes, but the sample size was too small to translate, so linguists mostly ended up being useless for the whole stay. We tried to take DNA samples, but we got no results, which is unsurprising, considering the age and conditions in which these bodies were kept. By the end of the 4 months, we had submitted our reports. We did not make any more significant findings, and we could not recover anything useful using remote subs we were using. Some people, including myself, wanted to continue, but the Navy did not want to talk about it. I suspect they have since recovered the wreck and moved it stateside. During my stay there, one of the Navy liaisons told me they did not care if we talk about what we saw there. No one would believe us without any proof, and the government's own disinformation psyops would bury the truth in the noise anyways. I have not told anybody about this, but I'm not worried about getting disappeared. I am just sad I will probably never get any answers or credit. Recently, I realized that since I was not allowed to take any notes with me, I should write it all down before I start to forget. Feel free to ask questions. I will try to answer. Just keep in mind, I was only a junior researcher there. Draw the craft. Fake related, just a quick sketch based off my memory. The actual wreck was not visible on cameras due to the buildup of sediment, but it stood out clearly on the sonar. Its rear end was covered by a sand dune. Red rectangle is where we found the pressurized chamber. You could also clearly see remains of the crater it made during its crash. The bodies were all shriveled up, that she might have had the biggest jugs you've ever seen, and you would not be able to tell. None of us were able to descend to the wreck in person, so best you could do is jerk off on a 1 centimeter long piece of bone sample, which to my knowledge, nobody attempted. I mean what? There isn't much to tell sadly. My expertise is extremophilic invertebrates, which is why I have any interest in space-related topics in the first place, so I did not have much to say about those humanoid bodies. I checked the samples we collected from mites and such and found nothing, but that is hardly surprising. My biggest contribution was assisting in lab work and being the first to notice that the small corpses were mutilated instead of just having fallen apart after death. We were not able to recover any viable DNA samples, but again, this can be chalked up to age and conditions. As far as my general knowledge of human anatomy goes, all 3 bodies were remarkably human, aside from weird proportions. There are many ways in which hair can change color, including oxidation or natural breakup of pigment over time. In our case, there was no oxygen at the time we discovered the chamber, but I can't say how conditions inside have changed over time. I mostly added that to preemptively react to replies about Nordics. Thank you for the answer. I discounted oxidation, well, due to the lack of oxygen. Are you aware of what the atmosphere inside did contain? If you can remember, what did the engraving look like? I don't remember the exact inscription, but the symbols looked something like this. There were never more than 3 objects on a single line. The overhead engraving consisted of 40 to 50 signs. Most other labels were much shorter, more like single word versus sentence. As for the conditions, it was pretty cold, 3 degrees Celsius, with atmosphere consisting overwhelmingly of nitrogen, with some other gases, including carbon monoxide. O2 was negligible. Since the bodies were so human-like, I don't think they could survive in such conditions. Most likely, they were the result of malfunction of life support systems during the crash, maybe some leak, etc. The temperature was likely just a result of the depth at which the object rested, as it was pretty close to the surrounding water. No notable radiation. We also did microbiology tests to see if there were any weird floating bacteria in there, but nothing unusual came up. Wasn't there something similar on the supposed Roswell control panels? Also, did the craft look at all like pig related? By weird proportions, I meant the female being huge and the two smaller bodies having atrophied bodies in relation to their heads. This was definitely an anatomical feature, as it could be observed in bones. I should also note that while impossible to say for certain, all bodies have broken bones that would suggest lethal injuries during the crash, so their deaths were most likely due to that and not change in pressure/atmosphere. Hard to tell. I've only ever seen sonar images and blurry underwater camera footage. I think it was more rounded. It was naturally much larger. Care to explain this picture? In our case, it's also not impossible that the craft could have had wings or some other protruding structures that have been destroyed. There was plenty of debris in the surrounding seafloor. Did the aliens have implants in their chests? They had implants throughout their whole bodies, but they were nowhere near as big and obvious. As already stated, initially, we mistook them for metal debris from the crash, which got embedded inside the corpses. Most were no bigger than 3 centimeters and looked like metal shards. The biggest implant was inside the female body. We did not take it out, but its shape and placement led us to believe it was an artificial kidney. The skeletons looked nothing like the Peruvian mummies. They were obviously human-like, with proper number of ribs, vertebrae, identical limb anatomy, etc. Why mutilated? From the crash? What was the estimated age/cache time, even if you could not get dating from samples, etc.? No. Both of the smaller bodies have had their noses and ears removed. This happened long before their deaths and the crash, as you could observe the scars and marks left by stitching. Considering their closeness to human anatomy, this likely did not affect their functioning much and was done for cultural reasons. They were also both castrated. We were unable to tell their sex from the bodies alone. As for the age, there were different numbers thrown around. Most convincing was one marine biologist who claimed that judging by the buildup of sediment and organisms growing around the wreck, it must be at least 500 years old. No idea how close or far off he was, considering many unknowns. Were there microorganisms on board of the craft? Is the ship still there on the bottom of the sea? Did the ship have a control panel? We ran some bacterial cultures using samples from the pressurized chamber. Nothing worth mentioning. Hard to tell if what we found was natively there, or if it was a result of contamination during our excavation. No killer or unusual bacteria as far as I know. The wreck might still be there, but my bet is that it was already removed by the Navy. If I were to bet, they wanted us just to confirm that it was dead and not dangerous before moving it to the US. There were plenty of control panels. Each body was seated behind one. All were busted, so all I saw was some buttons and, most likely, dead screens. 2 smaller bodies were plugged into the panels directly. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed the story so far. If you do and you want to hear more, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment down below, as it lets the algorithm know that you like my content and it promotes it to more people. My goal for the channel is to hit 50,000 subscribers, and we're closing in fast, so thank you, and back to the stories. When I was younger and dumber, I got involved with some of the less desirables of society. I was putting myself directly into potential deadly situations, and to this day, don't see how I didn't fuck something up and get dead. I became increasingly more confident over time, until a switch flipped, and I literally stopped experiencing fear of any sort. I would just call it a severe case of apathy. but even nightmares ceased. It was very strange. Shortly after, I began waking up, feeling a sensation of pressure against my body, not pinned to the bed, but the equivalent of having a cat on my chest. This happened on and off for a few weeks, and I would just roll to my side and fall back asleep. One evening, I returned home after 2 days of work and travel, tossed my shit on the floor and crawled into bed. It was still light out, and I noticed a shadow between the wall and ceiling, where a shadow could not have been. I was too exhausted to get up and investigate, so I just stared at it, confused, for a few minutes, until I eventually closed my eyes and passed out. The shadow became a common fixture, though not a constant, and always appeared in the same spot. It would dissipate if I approached to investigate, and would remain for maybe half a second after hit with a light. I would still feel the pressure and habitually roll over, but sometimes I would open my eyes and I began to note that the shadow was always present at the same time. However, this did not concern me. I had guessed that these occurrences were purely in my mind, assuming that perhaps no longer experiencing fear had caused the emotion to bottle itself up and visually and physically manifest itself. That was all that made sense to me, at least. At 3:45 a.m. one weekend, I remember the day because this is when shit got odd. I woke up to the alarm on my phone going off as planned. I reached over, hit snooze, and closed my eyes again. Probably a few minutes later, I felt the familiar pressure on my chest, but heavier this time. I opened my eyes and saw the small shadowy blob over my chest. Since I had already convinced myself these things were hallucinations, I took my hand and swatted at it, as if to shoo it away, while, as usual, rolling onto my side. I got about half roll when I felt a hand grab me on my left shoulder and forcibly tried to pull me onto my back again. The instant I felt the hand, I was overcome with a feeling of extreme rage. I lunged out of my bed onto my feet and found myself face to face last with a shadowy figure of equal height. I grabbed at the figure and tried to pin it to the wall. Only nothing was there, and all I managed to do was leave a me-sized imprint in the drywall. I stood in the dark for a while longer, verbally taunting it, hoping to see it again. Nothing. The 5-minute snooze alarm went off, snapping me out of the rage. I turned on the lights, noted the dent in my wall, and went to make breakfast. The few seconds long encounter left me completely drained physically and mentally. Insomnia followed me for a couple of weeks after, mainly because I wanted to see it again, but eventually, everything went back to normal. I had more frequent hallucinations, but nothing physical besides the usual pressure. Fleeting glimpses of the shadow became more common, along with seeing it at the foot of my bed while I slept a few times, but seeing it did not enrage me like the first time. The frequency could be as much as a few times a week, to as little as a couple of times a month. After this was going on for about 7 months, I started hooking up with a girl across the hall from my apartment. She was cool as hell and became a long-term F-buddy, so she was at my place quite often. This did not stop the frequency of the events. The only thing I would do is not get annoyed. Sometimes I wanted privacy, you know? We would be sleeping in bed, and I'd wake up and see Bob. Yeah, I named it. Creative, eh? Over by the foot of the bed, or the blob in the corner of the ceiling. I would tell it to fuck off, although it never did. One night, F-buddy was sitting in my computer chair, talking to me, while I was sitting on the floor cleaning a rifle next to the bedroom door. She stopped mid-sentence with a concerned look on her face. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me she swore she just saw someone walk through the living room. I chuckled and responded, /slipped, "Meh, it's just Bob." Shit, that couldn't be right. For one, Bob is in my head, and, second, I had never seen or felt the thing outside my bedroom. Ever. I asked her what exactly she saw, and she said she just thought she saw the shadow of someone walk by. That could only mean one of two things. Either it was a happy coincidence that she thought she saw something, or I was in fact not suffering from some sort of psychosis for the past 9 months. Also, I had to explain what "It's Just Bob" was all about. Surprisingly, it did not scare her off. In fact, it actually intrigued her. She mentioned that she would sometimes have trouble breathing if she was sleeping on her back at my place, so would usually sleep on her side. Okay, so maybe I was not crazy after all. I just had a goddamn creeper entity that had taken up residence in my home. I'm sure you can imagine just how much better I felt. I went about my affairs as normal, although my annoyance with Bob became more of a curiosity. F-Buddy stayed over more frequently, and we would wake each other up if something was happening, to see if the other was experiencing or could see the same thing. The pressure thing was always on an individual basis, and I was the only one who could look at Bob or the blob directly. If I woke her up to look, it would fade away. I would talk to it as well, acknowledging its presence with a "Hey Bob" in fleeting glances, and who, what, why whenever it was in direct view. One thing was for certain though, no longer treating it as a hallucination and as an entity caused more encounters with it. Also, while hard to explain, I used to just kind of feel like it was around and nothing much more. Now I was feeling as if I was being watched, and it would cause a higher level of alert. One morning I woke up and transitioned to a seated position on the edge of the bed. Instantly, I felt the familiar pressure. I tried to raise my head and look around, but it felt so heavy. I only moved a little before I was completely frozen in place. The rage came back. I fought with all of my strength to stand up, and I did. And that was the last thing I remember before waking up on the floor. The next few days were very fucked up. I was having losses of time in the duration of hours, finding myself waking up in the middle of conversation, monotonous daily activities, even banging the F-Buddy. As soon as I would come to, I was able to recall and catch up on everything that had happened, but it was much like if I were in a drunken stupor. Fuzzy details, but I was able to play it off. After a day and a half of that, I decided I needed to stay in the house. Filled F-Buddy in on what was going on, and she called out of work to monitor me. I had some short-term fades during the day playing video games, and apparently, when I cooked dinner, which she informed me tasted like shit. I'm a good cook. I had one last fade out that night. Details are from F-Buddy. She walked into the living room after realizing I was no longer in bed, and found me in my chair with the TV on. No biggie, except when she walked next to me. I was digging my fingers into the material of the armrest with one hand, and my temple resting against the top of a revolver in my other hand. My face looked very calm, but I kept grabbing at the armrest pretty hard. She stepped back and called my name. Anon? What are you doing? Watching cartoons. Why do you have the gun in your hand? It's mine, but this is not good. At this point, I looked directly at her and pulled the trigger, sending a round into the ceiling. She says I did not even flinch. I think you need to leave. She said she was scared shitless, said, okay, I'll leave, walked up to me, grabbed my hand with the gun, and punched me in the face. Twice. She was then able to take it from me. And this is where I woke up, face stinging, with her standing in front of me, screaming at me with a gun in her hand to get the fuck to bed. So I went the fuck to bed. She followed behind me, crying, and went directly to my closet while I got into my fucking bed and walked out with both of my gun cases, and then out to the front door. The fuzzy details started coming back about the same time I noticed my ear was ringing. Then, for the first time in a long time, I felt afraid, closer to terrified, and actually cried myself to sleep. I did not see her at all the next day. She sent a text to see if I was still alive. I responded along with a question as to the whereabouts of my guns. No answer. I heard nothing from her the following day either, and honestly, was a little worried to walk across the hall and talk to her. Turned out, I did not have to. The third night, she let herself in and woke me up as she crawled into bed with me. It's in my house now. At that point I realized I had not experienced anything over the 2.5 nights since she took my gun cases, but she apparently had. All hopes for a logical reason behind things were out. I told her it could be something in my cases. We went to her place, unloaded all the guns, and brought the ammo back to my place. We stayed at my place a couple more days, and when nothing seemed to happen, we went and stayed at her place. The first night, I felt pressure on my chest again. I woke her up, and we concluded it may be attached to one of my guns. My first guess was pretty easy. Well, first two. A Lawson 25 and an unknown 32 long revolver, the one I shot the ceiling with. Both were scrubbed guns I had acquired early on through what we'll call workplace disagreements. I always kept one with me in case it would come in handy. Both were stripped down and sledged before being tossed into the river. After that act, we went weeks without an encounter. I got the pressure thing once, but without the blob in the corner, and occasionally I'd get the feeling of something in my room, but it could have also just been paranoia. I eventually moved, and everything was 100% normal then. The events also caused me to stop associating and working with those I used to. For all I know, one of those weapons had some Jamaican voodoo put on it, and I opened myself up to the shit by doing things against my better judgment. I also wonder if the lack of fear was a form of empowerment to drag me in further until whatever it was could fully take hold. No way I'll ever know the intentions of something I don't understand, but what I do know is that a nympho with a hell of a punch possibly kept me from ending up dead or institutionalized. I used to be a cart pusher at Walmart, and I am convinced I saw a dead body one night. I had to work the evening shift, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., and after 7 p.m., the other guy got off work, so I had the rest of the night alone. It was a pretty easy night, not many carts. I spent most of my time just walking around the parking lot, listening to music and wasting time. It was getting close to 11, so I went around for the final pickup, gathering any loose carts from the very back of the parking lot. There weren't many, only like 5 or 6. One of them, however, was filled with a big, black, plastic bag, and it smelled awful. I did not know what it was, but I knew I had to push the cart around the building to the big dumpsters and throw it away, because the manager always does a sweep before I leave, and if I don't have the carts in, I will get in trouble. So, I pushed it around the side of the building, practically holding my breath because of the smell, till I got to the dumpster. I picked up the bag, but it was heavier than I expected. I did not care, just wanted to get rid of the thing, so I hurled it over. Just as I did, I was fucking positive I saw an arm just inside the top of the bag. I was paralyzed at first and thought about looking back in it, but I said fuck that, and I went back to the front of the store to put the cart up. A few minutes later, just before I was ready to go home, a guy showed up, speaking with an Indian accent, asking if a cart with a big bag was here somewhere. I told him, while my heart was beating fast, that I threw it away because I thought it was trash. He asked where, and I told him around the corner. I saw him quickly walk that way and around the corner. I clocked out and went home, trying not to think about what I saw.